Welcome to our third study here in the book of Daniel. For today, I'd like you to open up your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Just a quick recap before we get going. Daniel is a captive of the Babylonian Empire, specifically King Nebuchadnezzar. He was removed from his land, his homeland of Judah, by this conquering enemy called the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel was brought back to Babylon, and he was trained and placed into an advisory board, I think that's what you want to call it, to King Nebuchadnezzar. He would have been trained and he would have been learning the language, the culture, all kinds of different Babylonian things. But Daniel was not a man who would worship the Babylonian gods by a long shot. But Daniel was here in a high position because he had interpreted a marvelous dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. So Daniel is almost as a prime minister over the affairs of the Babylonian Empire, over the affairs of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he interpreted, as I said, this fantastic dream. I would refer you back there to chapter 2 to look at that. Today, we're going to be seeing Nebuchadnezzar, this king, set up an idol, or a statue of worship. And so we're going to see this marvelous, crazy kind of a thing. It's surprising that he would set up an idol. It's surprising because of what we see in Daniel chapter 2. After Daniel had interpreted this dream for Nebuchadnezzar, here's what we see recorded in chapter 2, verse 47 and 48. It says, "The king answered unto Daniel and saith, Of a truth, it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal the secret," that is, the secret of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Then it says, "The king made Daniel a great man, gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon." But then we see something happen surprising here in chapter 3. We read in verse 1, "Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image or statue of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon." So he's making this great, incredible idol. Now, we don't know exactly what it was. Was it a statue? Was it a pillar with a statue on the top of it? Was it solid gold, as it seems to imply here? Probably not. It was probably covered with gold. For something to be solid gold would be not only weak, not only heavy, of course, that would take an enormous amount of gold. But the bottom line to this is Nebuchadnezzar, though he seems to attribute greatness to Daniel's God in chapter 2, he recognized that Daniel has a God. He recognized the superiority of Daniel's God, and yet he is setting up this idol that he wants people to worship here in chapter 3. It is quite interesting that he does this. Well, it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up." Now, of course, a pagan culture would have had many idols, many gods that were worshipped. Nebuchadnezzar would not probably limit himself to one god. All the people that Nebuchadnezzar ruled over, now you got to remember his kingdom was very far reaching, covered a lot of territory, many different people, many different areas, many different geographical locations, cultures, all that kind of thing. So in his kingdom would have been many people who worshiped many gods. Now, one of the things that would be important to Nebuchadnezzar is to centralize things. After all, he is the supreme God, so to speak, the supreme king over all of them. One of the ways mankind has discovered to bring people together is with religion, a common religion. In the future, it is interesting that the Antichrist, when he does appear upon the earth, he's going to call all people to worship him. It's actually the false prophet, his cohort, that will direct attention to worshiping the image of the beast himself, the Antichrist himself. Why? Not only does he want to be worshiped as if he is God, because Satan is behind that whole thing, but you have to keep in mind the practical reason as well. All people from all diversities, from all backgrounds, from all cultures, from all locations, near, far, and everything in between, bringing them together into a one common religion is what is really very, very beneficial to a kingdom with all kinds of different people in it. So it's not surprising in a sense that Nebuchadnezzar wants to do this all the way back. There's some 2600 or so BC, 2550 to 600 BC. He's going to make this great image. And so what he does, he calls together kind of the who's who. Everybody that is ruling, everybody that is in a place of position or authority, whether it be a high position, an intermediate position, or even a local jurisdiction, he brings all these individuals together to worship this image at a dedication, as we read here in Daniel chapter 3. Then we read verse 3. Then the princes, the governors and captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And it's a great, big, tall, rather skinny kind of thing. It's all gold. We don't really know what it looked like. Probably, maybe his image. Who knows what it looked like? But it was some kind of an image that everybody would understand is a god of sorts. We read, then an herald cried, a spokesman, a man who would shout out on behalf of the king, calling people. Then an herald cried aloud, to you, to all the people now, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. Music is used to summon people. Music is used to let people know, probably to create a image inside of them. Music is an interesting thing. When we look at certain TV shows and movies, they almost always will have a theme song played before you enter into the movie, the TV show, the presentation, whatever it is. It is interesting how it calls you into something. And so, whatever this music sounded like, obviously it consisted of quite a number of interesting instruments here. It says cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery. Different translations will have different instrumentation here, but quite a lot of them. And when you hear this particular tune or this particular ensemble being played, fall down, worship the image, the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And it says, and whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar is quite an interesting man, isn't he? He's a tyrant. He's an absolute man with power. He cuts to the chase. He takes the guesswork out of what he wants. He has what he said here before, an incentive program that he often likes to use. Simply this: do what I say or die. In this case, thrown into a burning fiery furnace. I guess you would say, I think I'd bow down and worship. At least that's what most people would do. But remember now, we have Daniel. We have Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What we do know about them is they worship God. What we do know about them is they trust God. What we do know about them is for them, there is only one God. It's not here a God, there a God, everywhere a God. God, there is but one God. They are well aware of the fact that there are deities being worshipped. They're well aware of the fact that there may be demons. There may be Satan himself and other angelic beings behind the worship of other gods. Daniel and those who are worthy of true worship will worship only one God. So we can see right away there's going to be a bit of a collision here, a bit of a problem generated here. Therefore, at that time we read, verse 7, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And this must have pleased him because he's getting them all on the same page. They're worshiping the God that Nebuchadnezzar says to worship. He's probably not at all forbidding them to worship their own private gods, but this one is going to be the God that all people worship. And so the music plays, they fall down and worship. Verse 8, wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. That would be those who were brought captive from Judah. By the way, the word Jew comes from the word Judah. And so we see this in the scripture. We could likely call all Jews, and every time you see this word in the scripture, you could also call them Judahites. And there may be something important in that, because remember that the nation of Israel had been in a civil war, dividing itself into what was called Israel, consisting of 10 tribes to the north, and Judah, which consisted of the tribes to the south, made up of Judah, Benjamin, and of course Levi at the temple worship. Those people in the south were known as Judahites or Jews. So you could use that term Jew to describe Judahites. Does the term Jew refer to all those in the northern 10 tribes? A lot of people think that it does. So, in other words, all Hebrews from the 12 sons of Jacob qualified as Jews. But I think it's more accurate to be technical, understand that those were the lost tribes, so to speak, to the north, those northern tribes carried away by the Assyrians, 721 or so BC. In the south, Judahites or Jews. And the Jews or the Judahites were the ones indeed that were deported and captivated by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. So Judahites or Jews were the ones captive here in Babylon. Well, the Jews or the Judahites are accused of something by the Chaldeans. Now remember, the Chaldeans are part of that special class of occult practitioners that advise King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel is in that group, but he's not an occult practitioner. He doesn't cast spells. He doesn't interpret omens. He worships God. If he seeks knowledge and understanding about dreams or visions, whatever it might be, Daniel, as well as others who are faithful, go to the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, what we're seeing here is they're being accused because they're not falling down. They're opting out of worshiping this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar is causing all people to worship. So they come and accuse of these Jews. They spake and said to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. I guess that's their way of addressing him, to kind of curry favor, act as if they're fully supportive, all that kind of thing. It's just speech of the court. They say, Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Probably because Daniel had exemplified himself and risen to the top of this advisory board, there probably was some jealousy. Also, always understand that behind the scenes, and this is important in life, it's important here in the book of Daniel, and that is what we see outwardly: people, circumstances, wars, carried on events, and all those kind of things that happen all around us. Behind the scenes, invisibly, are spiritual entities. We see in Ephesians chapter 6, for instance, the Apostle Paul said, We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in heavenly, spiritual, invisible, if you will, places. So these Chaldeans do not worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Daniel and his friends. They worship a host of demonic entities, really. So behind the scenes, there's a push to persecute, to prosecute, to destroy, to remove, to discredit Daniel and all those who would worship God. We should also interject a thought here. We saw in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar seemed rather impressed with the God that Daniel worshiped. And he said very good things about the God that Daniel worshiped. And then right here in chapter 3, he turns around and he makes an idol that he requires other people to worship. How do you account for that? Well, I think the best way to account for that is to understand that behind the scenes, as always, dark forces, spiritual entities, Satan himself, angels, seraphims, fallen angels, seraphims, who knows what is there in the invisible realm. But they, of course, would be pushing. They, of course, would be motivating. They, of course, would be trying to influence, create power, and all that kind of thing behind Nebuchadnezzar despite the fact that he said good things about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Indeed, even among us today, as a Christian, as a person who worships God, don't we find it shocking sometimes the things that other Christian people do? Perhaps you're dismayed sometimes at the things you do. Well, we need to understand that behind us is an enemy that is pushing, prodding, motivating, pushing us into evil things. Of course, we also have a nature that gravitates toward sinful things. But it's always surprising the sinful things that godly people do. People that worship God, people that give credence to God, people that say good things about God, people that, raise their kids in a godly environment, Christian school, all that kind of things. Many times, nonetheless, we find shockingly bad behavior, shockingly bad things going on. This is reality, and this is how real life plays out. Nebuchadnezzar would be no different. The Chaldeans doing their predictable thing, but Nebuchadnezzar, one hand, saying something wonderful about the God of Daniel, promoting Daniel, all that kind of thing, and yet setting up this image of worship. So he's getting this complaint about Daniel and those like Daniel who do not want to fall down and worship. As he says here, shall fall down and worship the golden image, end of chapter 3, verse 10, continuing verse 11. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are, it goes on, certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Why is Daniel not here? We know that he would not worship this golden image, but for whatever reason, the accusation seems to be focused here in context upon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel seems to be, who knows, maybe off conducting business, maybe somewhere else. Maybe they're unaware. Maybe they don't dare to actually accuse Daniel. But he is not going to worship and fall down. But these three are singled out. Well, then Nebuchadnezzar reacts here. The Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. This king does not like to be defied. This king does not like to be contradicted. This king has fury and rage if anybody violates his sovereign will. He will not tolerate that. He will not endure that. He will not look the other way. This is his operating procedure. This is his MO. It is fury. It is rage. Bring them here. Verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? How in the world, he's thinking, would you ever contemplate defying me? Now he says, if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music. Isn't it interesting how the description here repeats? It seems rather laboriously, but yet it does. It says, when you hear these things, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. But if you worship not, ye shall be the same hour cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace, who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands. So God is great in chapter 2, but he's not able to be greater than Nebuchadnezzar's decree here in his own mind in chapter 3. What does this king really know about God? Maybe a few things, but not as much as he could. He will learn as we go, don't we all? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered, verse 16, and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. We're not going to be worried about how we answer. We're going to answer truthfully. As it says here, if it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine king, or out of thy hand, O king. How bold and courageous can you get? They continue. But if not, Be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. I'll tell you what, sometimes it takes boldness to do the right thing. These were men who had thought about their witness, thought about their testimony. They are convinced of God. They are certain of what God would require of them. They know that God can rescue them. They know that God cannot. They will go down whatever God decides. They are settled. They are going to do what God has required of them. It is interesting if we look further into the future to end times. When the Antichrist appears and the false prophet with him, people will be given an opportunity to worship this same image in a sense, the same God in a sense, the same demonic thing in a sense. But those who are faithful will be faced with a proposition. You can live if you worship, or you can die. Well, many people are going to die in the end times, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're going to go with God. Now, we know that in the future, people are actually going to die. They're going to go ahead and succumb to the devices of the Antichrist, to the false prophet. Many of them are going to be beheaded. Many of them are going to refuse to take the mark. I know we're getting ahead of ourselves here in the book of Daniel, but definitely there is a connection. Be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. One more thought before we come back to Daniel. In the future, when one is given the opportunity to worship the Antichrist or take the mark of the beast, please understand that it is clear in the book of Revelation. Those whose names are found written in the book of life will not take the mark, will not worship the image of the Antichrist in that future occasion. Now, I'm not going to develop it a lot. It is something that is very interesting to understand. Those who belong to the Lord, written in the book of life, and your name was written in that book of life before the foundation of the earth. If you belong to the Lord, people will argue that point, people will dispute that point. I'm just kind of putting it out for you to contemplate and think. We'll cover that perhaps in another study a bit more fully. But they're not going to worship this image or the gods that King Nebuchadnezzar wishes of them. Verse 19, then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, not a surprise, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it wont to be heated. So throw some more logs on the fire, turn up the burner, make this thing a real powerful example. He wants other people to see this. He wants to probably get rid of some of that rage and tension that he has. But certainly he's a smart guy, though he's a furious guy. He wants to send a message. He wants to get this job done. Maybe he's worrying that this God will defy him and rescue them. His foolish, his inability to really combat God will become evident, but in his puny mind, perhaps he thinks that he can resist God. If the furnace is hot enough, perhaps he'll overcome what he's worried that God might do. So that's what he's about to do. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men were bound in their coats, their hose in their hats, and their other garments. So their old-fashioned garments that they wore, old-fashioned to us, contemporary to them. And they were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. We don't know what this thing looked like. Was it a great big pit, some kind of a constructed thing? We don't really know, but they were cast in. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What a tremendous scene it was. This fire is hot, it's raging, and yet these men know that they must do as they are told in delivering Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the flames. They sacrifice their own life as the flames overcome them. It is hot. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So we get the idea that somehow from an elevated position, they were thrown in, they fell down into this thing. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did we not cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. However this thing was made, you could actually see into it. And Nebuchadnezzar wasn't looking to see that these men were burned up. But he notices something that shocks and astonishes him. He asked this question, Didn't we throw three men bound into the fire? He sees something different. He answered and said, Lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the fourth is like the Son of God, or he looks like a God. Probably that's the way the language read. He looks divine. He looks somehow as Nebuchadnezzar would envision a God to look. And I'll tell you what, it's not quite exactly a God like Nebuchadnezzar thinks. And it's really not, in a sense, probably thought to be Jesus. So some people would say this is Jesus in the furnace with them. But it is really, for sure, an angel of God. So it's God in the form of an angel there with the three in the midst of the fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and he spoke and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God. How about that? He's attributing this to God already. Come forth and come hither. Now, why he does not address this fourth man that he obviously sees, we do not know. But he does address Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's able to speak to them in the midst of the fiery furnace. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. What that looked like, I guess you can use your imagination. If you've seen a film or a depiction of this, maybe that's what comes to mind, but it is fiery, it is hot. They're walking around in the coals and the flames and the heat. It's terrible and consuming, but not toward them. And they walk out. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being some of the ones who bowed down, by the way, to this image that was set up. It says, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. They were obviously miraculously protected. This is one of those wonderful stories that is shared, recognized, remembered, shared with children in Sunday school time and time again. It is the stuff of miracles. It's not fanciful. The Bible demands that though it is an incredible book, it is God who's the author. And so we have it understood that God is supernatural. God does supernatural things. The Bible is his record of supernatural things. And so we see that right here. Well, then spake Nebuchadnezzar and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their God. How shocking is it when you think about Nebuchadnezzar? He's a all-powerful potentate. He's a tyrant. He kills people on a whim. He has fury that will throw people into a fiery furnace. He has fury that will slay someone and make a dunghill out of their home and take away their family and their future and all that kind of thing. But he's quick, it seems, strange maybe it seems, to bend his knee to recognize the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God, as it says here, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He recognizes that God has sent his angel. He has a certain level of perception. How interesting is that? He says that the king's words have been changed, and he seems to be in agreement with that. I think it's safe to say he's not all the way formed. He's not all the way worshiping. He's not all the way converted. He's not all the way convicted. But he's moving in that direction. God knows how to move people. We have many people today that have positive things at times to say about God. They think good thoughts some of the time about God. But like many people are just not all the way there with God. God knows how to get into a person's eyesight. God knows how to get into someone's mind, into their thinking processes, into their heart, into the innermost part of being. And sometimes God does things incredibly powerful, like here. Other times he does things small, but consistently one after the next. Nebuchadnezzar is witness to a marvelous miracle. The apostle Paul was struck down off his horse and stricken blind. He, of course, was healed of his blindness, an incredible miracle. Others witnessed the resurrection. Still others have a still small voice, yet it's still God who witnesses inside of the heart. God is busy. God knows how. God knows when to reach out and touch people. He's doing that with Nebuchadnezzar, strange enough. He says, therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, now note this again, shall be cut in pieces, their houses be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Well, what about that idol? What about all that? Well, right in front of all the people that saw the idol bow down and worship, they all too got a lesson whose God is greater. And they even see Nebuchadnezzar capitulate and himself submit to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Quite a remarkable account here. Well, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So certainly God was with them. They were with God. They were convinced of God. They were willing to serve God no matter what the price, no matter what the cost. They would just as soon have died in that furnace as lived miraculously through those flames. But God had a purpose in all this. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not only did not die, not only were they accused by their detractors and those that served in this occult board of advisors to the king, but in the midst of that, they were promoted. You see, God does raise up kings. He takes kings down. He makes people high. He makes people low. Trust God. Put your faith in God today. What a blessing it is to study here in the book of Daniel. I hope you'll come back for our next study. May God richly bless you. Bye for now.